Gynocentrism is actually a rather simple idea, although most people who talk about it don't derive it correctly. I will be talking about gynocentrism in this video, but let us first at least address the derivation of this concept. Where does it come from? And why are we a gynocentric society or civilization? It's important to point this out because every idea needs a foundation. And the foundation here is pretty simple. We are a gynocentric civilization, or society, or people, because of certain inequalities that exist in the realm of reproduction. Namely, the fact that women are egg bearers and men are shooters of sperm, as it were, where in a situation in some far removed time from our own, if the majority of men were wiped out, but not the majority of women, reproduction, and thus the lineages present there, could have continued relatively unabated, because one man can inseminate many women per day, at least in theory. Whereas if the reverse had happened, if most of the women were wiped out, but there were many men, you have a problem all of a sudden. And from this very simple equation, you almost get a type of axiomatic sort of behavior which derives its decisions from the fact that without women, lineages and the species will disappear, and therefore you prioritize female life over male life. You, in a modern cultural setting, prioritize women's wishes and wants. In former times, this was much less so the case, due to the harshness of the environment, obviously. And so women were, in some ways, just as men were, in their own ways, limited by the bounds of society and civilization as to what they could do. We all were limited in the past, whether male or female, but of course in the myopic modern and or feminist view, it was only women who were limited or quote-unquote oppressed. But in more comfortable, civilized times, how gynocentrism manifests from this simple equation of women being the limiting factor in reproduction is that we count out to women's wishes. We give them what they want. We are concerned about women. That is where gynocentrism stems from. And because of this, we will never escape it. We will only at best become cognizant of it, and in such cases, the vast majority of people who do become cognizant of the concept and its pervasiveness in our world will be men. Because men, not receiving the same treatment, will be led to feel the brunt of that lack. It's only in the lack of something that you become aware of what leads to that lack. If you're poor, for example, you have a lack of money, and that's felt very acutely. A rich man, by way of contrast, can't perceive that whatsoever. It's always like that. And so we're in this current era of COVID, this thing that is raging across the globe, and we're certainly not close to a peak. Things have started closing down. We're really at the beginning. And of course, predictably, one could argue, there are articles in recent times being pumped out with the usual men hit hardest, but women most affected. There'll be two articles in the low bar that I'm referencing specifically, but I guarantee you'd find more if you made an effort. One coming from an Australian news source, the other coming from Bloomberg. The title of the Australian one is as reasonable as you could imagine: Coronavirus Australia, Why Women Will Feel the Impact More Than Men. No amount of hand washing or social distancing is going to change the fact that women will be more adversely impacted by the coronavirus pandemic than men. And the reasons behind this phenomenon are more sociological than biological, experts say. This stems from the fact that, based on the data we have available, men are more impacted directly by the coronavirus. There's a higher rate of incidence and a higher rate of fatally succumbing to this ailment. Now, there's some speculation as to why that's the case. One popular theory posits that men's immune system is more reactive, and thus the immune response might have something to do with this, but it's not entirely clear. We do know, though, based on the limited data, that men are more adversely affected. More men die of this. more men are likely to get infected. And yet, people have the gall to publish articles about women being more adversely affected. And inevitably, as I read off the first few lines of that particular article, it always comes down to how women are going to be socially affected. Remember eons ago when Mrs. Clinton claimed that women were the primary victims of war because all their male relatives and loved ones die? So never mind the deprivation of life to the men, it's the women remaining. And thus it's similar in this case, although arguably the proportions aren't there, not yet at least, if ever, that men are disproportionately affected, but women are the ones who suffer more. And every article that talks about this talks about it from a social angle. Nurses, women working at the home, homemakers, and how they're going to be affected in their work, as the men in their lives are incapacitated and suffer, and yada, yada, yada. And this sort of thing is a good and potent reminder of your situation in the world, fundamentally. Not too dissimilar to some of the things I talked about in that video on your own. You could get a situation where some pandemic or epidemic potentially threatened 90% of the male population. And still, I guarantee you, people would write articles and claim that women were most affected. Why? Because they would be left over to deal with the harsh reality. The suffering and passing of these hypothetical men in this hypothetical 90% situation, you can forget that. That's not going to be part of that equation. And in reminding ourselves of these things, it's important to stay true to yourself. Remember, gentlemen, the world doesn't care about you. If it did, you wouldn't get articles like these. And if it did, they would occasionally listen to you. They would care about your wants and needs, but you don't really see that, do you? No, instead we're told that homemakers are going to be more adversely affected than the man who is suffering from respiratory failure in some rat hole of a hospital somewhere on this earth, who is soon to pass away. Now there's a further element here that I want to stress. As many of you know, Italy has been hit hard. And at the time of me making this video, Italy has arguably been hit the hardest. Per capita, Italy has experienced more people passing and succumbing to this than any other country in the world. They have more infections, etc., etc. And naturally, under such circumstances, as is one wont to do when things get rough, the practice of triage becomes prominent, which is, of course, sizing up patients within a population and attending to them based on their need and their perishability, so to speak. So the oldest of the old, they're actually being disregarded in Italy. Triage is in full effect. And if you have a pre-existing condition, you will likely also be disregarded, mostly due to shortages and a dearth in resources to attend to these people. Nonetheless, it's what happens in times of short supply. And there's always going to be a hierarchy. So in terms of the triage in Italy, they start with the oldest of the old, then they might start with the next oldest category, then they might say people with pre-existing conditions aren't worth it, etc., etc. It's just how it is. Guess, according to the news, broadly speaking, whatever the country might be, where the greatest concern is pregnant women. Is this any surprise? I'm not going to say this is good or bad. I'm simply stating the facts here. Pregnant women, again, we go back to that primordial axiom. Women are the limiting factor in reproduction. They can get pregnant. Men can't. There you go. We will always return to this type of behavior. But imagine a scenario, gentlemen, in which triage becomes far more widespread. They will cut through this hierarchy where they base treatment within a population in accordance with a person's susceptibility and perishability. And if things were to get really, really bad, which I'm not claiming they will necessarily, but if they were to, I guarantee that even able-bodied men would be disregarded. It certainly would be women and children first, and arguably it would be women before children. Remember, famously on the Titanic, women were given priority over children. And again, women offer the possibility of further reproduction down the line, and so our hindbrain just reacts that way. It's just the way it is. And this should serve as a lesson to us all, of to the degree that we can be self-reliant, we should be. And we should be cognizant of this. And I think also we should be charitable towards our fellow men, because the gods only know the world will not be charitable to you or your fellow men. Now, outside the manosphere, that's of course difficult, because the world is rife simply with male-on-male competition for female resources, and the resources external to the female that are needed to procure the female. But at least within the manosphere, we have the unique opportunity to be charitable and kind and compassionate to each other, to a degree that other men cannot be, because the world will not. In that absence, in that lack of understanding that you shall neither be prioritized nor shall a rat's buttocks be given about you, that is where some of these ideas come into play. And COVID is showing us this slowly but surely. It's a potent reminder of the most primordial, primeval of axioms in the world of biology and our own existence, and a reminder to us as individuals of who we are and the fact that we are disposable. Now, some men embrace that disposable role. I certainly won't. I shall remain defiant to my dying day on that particular point. Gratitude and service ought to be earned, I think, ultimately. If you're not kind to yourself or your fellow man, no one else will be, because that's the world we live in. All going back to that simple fact of biology. Men hit hardest, women most affected. Anyway, gentlemen, I hope you have a pleasant remaining week. Be safe, take care of yourself in light of all that's going on. And as always, may the gods watch over you. And most importantly, may they give more than they take. Until the next time.